On the morning of March 1st, 2015, in a quiet suburb of Denver, Colorado, a mother of two failed to pick up her children from religious school. By 3:40 that afternoon, paramedics would pronounce 44-year-old Stacy Feldman dead in her bathroom, the shower still running, her body sprawled beneath a metal rack. Her husband told emergency operators he'd found her unconscious after returning home from errands. The scene appeared tragic: a slip, a fall, water everywhere, except there was no water on the floor. No logical explanation for the 80-plus injuries covering her torso, arms, and face. And no reason, investigators would later learn, for a woman who had just told a stranger on the phone that morning, "I'm done with him," to die so suddenly, so violently, in the privacy of her own home. What looked like an accident would take 7 years, 3 pathologists, and a sisterhood of determined women to expose as murder. This is the story of how a single email, sent at 6:20 a.m. by a woman named Susan McBride, set in motion a chain of events that would unravel a decade of lies, financial control, and infidelity, and prove that sometimes the only thing standing between a killer and freedom is a sister who refuses to let go. Before we go deeper, subscribe if you love true crime documentaries, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Stacy Feldman was born the youngest of 3 sisters in Muncie, Indiana, a modest Midwestern city where family ties ran deep and everyone knew their neighbors. Her older sister, Susan Altman, would remember her as Daddy's little girl, the baby of the family who brought light into every room she entered. Friends described Stacy as effervescent, someone who loved the color pink, who threw herself into celebrations, who made people feel seen. But beneath the bubbly exterior was a woman driven by a singular dream: to become a wife and mother. As Stacy moved through her 20s and into her 30s, she watched friends marry and start families while she remained single. The clock, as her sister Susan would later recall, was ticking. Stacy wanted children desperately, wanted the white picket fence life she'd imagined since childhood, and so when she was introduced to Robert Feldman, charismatic, confident, 14 years her senior, she believed she'd finally found the man who could give her that life. Robert Feldman, known to friends as Bob, worked in sales, though his track record was checkered at best. He had a way of presenting himself that inspired confidence, at least initially. A mutual friend, Jan Goldenberg, would later tell Dateline that Bob was charismatic, that he knew how to make his way into someone's heart. Stacy fell for him quickly. The couple married around 2005 in a ceremony at the Ritz in Montreal, Canada, a wedding Stacy had dreamed of, complete with a tiara that made her feel, for one shining day, like a princess in her own fairy tale. They settled in the Denver suburbs, a sprawling area where young families flourished, where the mountains loomed in the distance and the neighborhoods were clean and quiet. Within a few years, Stacy gave birth to a daughter and later a son. From the outside, the Feldmans appeared to have everything: a comfortable home, healthy children, the kind of suburban stability that looked perfect on social media and in holiday cards. Stacy threw herself into motherhood with the same enthusiasm she'd brought to everything else. She became president of the parent-teacher organization at Southmore Elementary School, where her children attended. She volunteered for Partners Seeking a Cure, a non-profit funding research into liver disease. She was the kind of mother who showed up to every school event, who baked cupcakes for classroom parties, who knew the names of her children's friends and their parents. But behind the facade of domestic bliss, cracks were forming. Bob's career as a salesman was, by all accounts, mediocre. He struggled to meet quotas, to close deals, to provide the kind of financial stability Stacy had hoped for. This meant that Stacy, who had dreamed of staying home with her children, was forced to work to help support the household. The arrangement frustrated her, but Bob's controlling nature made it difficult to challenge the status quo. The house was in Bob's name. The credit cards were in Bob's name. Stacy had no independent financial foothold, no leverage, no escape route. Bob knew this, and he used it. Friends and family would later recall him threatening Stacy. If she tried to leave, he would take the children. He would leave her with nothing. It was a pattern of financial and emotional control that Susan Altman, living across the country in the Boston area, began to recognize during phone calls with her sister. Stacy would confide in Susan, would admit that the marriage was troubled, that Bob was difficult, that she felt trapped. But Stacy was also deeply invested in making the marriage work. She had waited so long to become a mother, had built her entire identity around this family. The idea of failure was almost unbearable. And so she stayed, even as the problems multiplied. Bob's infidelity was an open secret, at least within the family. Throughout their 10-year marriage, Bob maintained profiles on dating apps and websites, using aliases like Robert Wolf and Mike Reed. Sometimes he claimed to be a divorced conservative Jew in his mid-50s. Other times, he presented himself as a reformed Jew in his mid-40s. The details shifted depending on the audience, but the pattern was consistent. Bob was chronically unfaithful, always looking for the next conquest, always lying about his marital status. Stacy knew about some of these affairs. Friends would later say that Bob had cheated before, that Stacy had confronted him, that he had promised to change, but he never did. By early 2015, the marriage was clearly in crisis. Susan Altman, from her vantage point in Boston, worried constantly about her sister. She knew Stacy was struggling, knew the marriage was toxic, but she never imagined how deadly Bob's betrayal would become. In February 2015, Bob Feldman was active on Tinder, the dating app where users swipe through photos looking for matches. He was using the name Robert Wolf, and his profile presented him as divorced, available, the kind of man who was ready to move on from a failed marriage. It was on Tinder that he matched with Susan McBride, a woman who had no idea she was about to become entangled in a murder case that would span 7 years. Bob began the relationship with lies. He told Susan that he was divorced, that his ex-wife was an absentee mother who showed little interest in their children. Susan, who had been navigating the often disappointing world of online dating, found Bob charming at first. Their first date at a local restaurant felt easy and natural. Susan would later testify that the conversation flowed effortlessly, that she left thinking Bob was a nice guy, someone she could see herself dating seriously. But when Susan tried to verify Bob's story, when she searched for information about Robert Wolf online, she came up empty. There were no social media profiles, no professional listings, nothing that corroborated the identity he'd given her. Alarm bells started ringing. Susan attempted to break off the relationship, but Bob was persuasive. He told her he'd been the victim of a stalker, that he used fake names online for his own protection. He insisted he was separated from his wife, that the divorce was imminent. Susan, against her better judgment, decided to give him another chance. On February 26, 2015, just 4 days before Stacy Feldman's death, Bob came to Susan's house for dinner. They talked for hours, and eventually, they had sex. But Bob's behavior immediately afterward was strange. He cancelled their plans for the following weekend. He became distant, evasive, as if he were already pulling away from the relationship. Susan's suspicions returned stronger this time. She decided to do her own detective work, using the limited information Bob had given her. She searched for any mention of Bob Feldman, combining his real name with details she'd gleaned from their conversations. Eventually, she found Stacy Feldman, listed on the Southmore Elementary School website, where Stacy was identified as the president of the parent-teacher organization. Susan realized with a sinking feeling that Bob had been lying to her all along. He wasn't divorced, he wasn't separated. He was married, with 2 young children, living a double life. Susan faced a difficult decision. She could walk away quietly, chalk it up to another bad online dating experience and move on with her life. Or she could do the right thing and tell Stacy what her husband had been up to, even though it meant revealing her own involvement in the affair. Susan chose honesty. On the morning of March 1, 2015, at 6:20 a.m., Susan sent an email to Stacy Feldman. In it, she explained that she had met Bob on Tinder, that he had told her they were separated, and that she wanted Stacy to know the truth about his infidelity. Susan's email was direct and compassionate. She wrote, "My name is Susan McBride. You don't know me, but I met your husband on a dating site called Tinder. He told me you had been separated for quite some time. If you're not separated, you should know that he's cheating on you." Susan also forwarded copies of the text exchanges she'd had with Bob, providing concrete evidence of his deception. She didn't expect Stacy to respond. She thought perhaps that Stacy would delete the email. that she'd be angry or defensive. But what happened next would become crucial to the case against Bob Feldman. Just before 9 a.m. that morning, Stacy called Susan. The two women had never met, had never spoken before, but Stacy's voice was calm, remarkably composed given the circumstances. Susan would later remember being struck by Stacy's kindness. "She was so sweet and kind," Susan testified. "She wasn't angry." Stacy told Susan that this wasn't the first time Bob had cheated on her. He had been unfaithful before, she said, and she had tried to make the marriage work despite his betrayals. But then Stacy said something that would become vital evidence in the murder case to come. She told Susan, "I'm done with him." 4 words, simple, declarative, final. "I'm done with him." Spoken just hours before Stacy's death, those words would provide prosecutors with a crucial motive for murder. Stacy Feldman had reached her breaking point. She was ready to leave Bob, ready to end the marriage, ready to take control of her life. And for a man who had spent a decade controlling his wife financially and emotionally, that was unacceptable. Around 10 a.m. that morning, Stacy sent what would be her final text message. It was to a friend, a routine message mentioning that she was supposed to pick up the children from religious school at noon and take them to a Purim carnival at Temple Sinai, the synagogue the family attended. It was an ordinary message, the kind of logistical update mothers send a dozen times a day. Stacy had no reason to believe it would be her last communication with the outside world. She never got the chance to pick up her children. She never made it to the carnival. By the time noon arrived, Stacy Feldman was already dead. March 1st, 2015, had started like any other Sunday morning for the Feldman family. Bob dropped their 2 children off at Temple Sinai for religious school at around 8:30 a.m. The plan, as it had been every Sunday, was for Stacy to collect them at noon and take them to the Purim carnival being held at the synagogue. But when noon came and went, Stacy was nowhere to be seen. The school staff tried calling her mobile phone, no answer. They called again. Still nothing. Growing concerned, they called Bob to ask if someone else was supposed to collect the children. Bob's response was telling, though the staff didn't realize it at the time. He told them that he would be there shortly to get the children. But when 12:45 p.m. arrived and Bob still hadn't shown up, the staff called him again. This time, Bob changed his story. He claimed that he thought a family friend was collecting the children, a story that directly contradicted what he had told them just 45 minutes earlier. Finally, at 1:05 p.m., Bob arrived at the synagogue to pick up his children. The teacher who spoke to him later told investigators that Bob's behavior seemed odd. He appeared disheveled, his clothes rumpled, his demeanor curt and impatient, quite different from his usual friendly persona. Instead of taking the children directly home to their mother, Bob spent the afternoon at the Purim carnival with them, then took them to a bicycle shop. It wasn't until around 3 p.m. that Bob and the children finally returned home. His daughter, who was around 9 years old at the time, would later testify that she had been excited to show her mother the prizes she had won at the carnival. But as they walked into the house, Bob told her to put her coat away downstairs rather than going upstairs to see her mother. It was an unusual instruction, one that would take on sinister significance in hindsight. What happened next was captured in a 911 call that would later be scrutinized by investigators, played in a courtroom, and dissected by experts looking for clues about what Bob knew and when he knew it. At approximately 3:15 p.m., Bob called emergency services. The recording captured him pleading with the operator, his voice strained and desperate. "Oh my God, I need help. Please help me. Please, my wife's not breathing." Bob told the 911 operator that he had found Stacy unconscious in their bathroom shower with the water running. He claimed that he pulled her out of the tub and was attempting CPR while waiting for paramedics to arrive. The operator stayed on the line, giving Bob instructions, trying to guide him through chest compressions and rescue breathing. But there was something wrong with Bob's story, something that first responders would notice immediately when they arrived at the scene. Despite Bob's claims that he had pulled Stacy from a running shower, there was no water on the bathroom floor. This was highly unusual. Emergency responders who deal with drowning or water-related incidents are accustomed to finding wet floors, soaked towels, puddles spreading across tile. But the Feldman bathroom was dry. As one first responder later noted in their report, They had never seen a body pulled from water without there being water everywhere. It defied logic. It defied physics. If Bob had truly dragged Stacy's body from a running shower, the floor should have been drenched. There were other inconsistencies too, details that didn't add up. During the 911 call, despite Bob's claims that he was performing CPR, there were no sounds on the recording consistent with chest compressions or rescue breathing. No rhythmic thumping, no heavy breathing from exertion. Instead, investigators would later note that there were sounds of a toilet flushing and items being knocked over, suggesting that Bob might have been staging the scene rather than trying to save his wife's life. When paramedics arrived at 3:40 p.m., they found Stacy Feldman lying in the shower, her body positioned beneath a metal rack, the water still running. They attempted resuscitation, but it was clear she had been dead for some time. Rigor mortis had already begun to set in, a biological process that typically starts 2 to 4 hours after death. Stacy Feldman was pronounced dead at the scene. Detective Randy Dennison was one of the first investigators to arrive. Even at this early stage, he found Bob's behavior suspicious, though he couldn't quite put his finger on what was wrong. According to the arrest affidavit filed 3 years later, Bob appeared to be acting as if in shock or confused, but in a way that seemed performative rather than genuine. At one point, Detective Dennison wrote, "Bob walked away as if he was confused, giving the detective the impression he was overacting in an effort to avoid speaking with him." The firefighters who responded to the scene also found Bob's behavior troubling. According to the affidavit, they described him as being overdramatic and purposely uncooperative. He wouldn't answer direct questions. He kept moving around the house, making it difficult for investigators to get a clear timeline of events. This wasn't the behavior typically seen from someone who had just discovered their spouse's body. Most people in that situation are either in a state of shock, barely able to speak, unable to process what's happening, or they're desperate to help, answering every question, providing every detail they can remember. Bob was neither. He was evasive, theatrical, and strangely detached, but at this stage, there was no obvious evidence of foul play. Stacy appeared to have died in what looked like a bathroom accident. Perhaps she had slipped in the shower. Perhaps she had a medical emergency, a stroke, a heart attack, something that caused her to fall. An autopsy would be needed to determine what had really happened. On March 2nd, 2015, the day after Stacy's death, Dr. Kelly Kowalski performed the autopsy at the Denver Medical Examiner's Office. This was significant for several reasons. Dr. Kowalski was relatively inexperienced, with this being one of her first solo autopsies. She was working under the supervision of more senior pathologists, but the responsibility for the initial examination fell to her. What she found was deeply troubling, but also confusing. The autopsy revealed that Stacy Feldman had sustained more than 80 separate injuries to her body. These included bruises, hemorrhages, abrasions, and a chipped tooth. The injuries were scattered across her torso, arms, back, and face. She also had petechial hemorrhages in her eyes, small burst blood vessels that can be a sign of strangulation or suffocation. But despite the extensive injuries, Dr. Kowalski was unable to determine exactly how Stacy had died. There was no water in Stacy's lungs, ruling out drowning. There were no obvious signs of a heart attack or stroke. The injuries suggested trauma, but trauma consistent with what? A fall, a beating, an assault? Dr. Kowalski consulted with senior pathologists, and together they made a decision that would haunt the case for years. The cause and manner of death were officially listed as undetermined. In forensic pathology, an undetermined ruling is a kind of professional limbo. It means the pathologist cannot, with reasonable medical certainty, say what killed the person or whether the death was natural, accidental, suicidal, or homicidal. It's not a determination of innocence or guilt. It's simply an acknowledgement that the evidence is ambiguous. But in practical terms, an undetermined ruling can be devastating for a criminal investigation. Without a clear cause of death, prosecutors are reluctant to bring charges. Defense attorneys will argue that if even the medical examiner can't say how someone died, how can a jury convict someone of causing that death? This ruling would keep the Stacy Feldman case in limbo for years and nearly allow a killer to escape justice. Bob's behavior during the initial investigation continued to raise red flags. When questioned by police in the days following Stacy's death, he gave conflicting accounts of his activities on the morning of March 1st. Initially, he claimed he had left for work as normal, gone to the gym, and then met a colleague at a bus depot in Broomfield, where part of his job involved checking advertisements on buses. But Bob's story began to shift. In a follow-up conversation, he told Denver police officers that on the day of his wife's death, Stacy had told him she was tired and was sleeping when he left home with the couple's children around 8:30 a.m. He said he returned around noon, called out to his wife but got no answer, changed clothes in the laundry room, cleaned the garage because a shelf had fallen, and then went to a park and worked out. None of this was verifiable. There were no witnesses who could confirm Bob's whereabouts between 8:30 a.m. and 3 p.m. No gym records, no surveillance footage, just Bob's word. Bob also made several claims about Stacy's condition that proved to be false. He told police that she had consumed edibles containing THC, the active compound in a certain plant that affects the brain, the night before her death. But Stacy Feldman's toxicology report, which tested for a wide range of substances, showed no signs of THC in her system. He claimed she had been unwell for months, that she had even missed work for several days before her death. But this wasn't supported by evidence. Stacy's colleagues at Partners Seeking a Cure said she had been at work as recently as the Friday before her death, showing no signs of illness. Her friends said she had seemed normal, perhaps a bit stressed about her marriage, but not physically unwell. Bob's lies were piling up, but without a clear cause of death, investigators couldn't move forward. In what would later prove to be a significant motive, Bob collected on Stacy's life insurance policy just months after her death. Robert Feldman was paid $750,000, the proceeds from a life insurance policy on Stacy Feldman that had been purchased 5 years earlier. Interestingly, while Bob had a substantial life insurance policy on Stacy's life, there was no reciprocal policy on his own life. This asymmetry would later be seen as evidence of premeditation. Why insure your wife's life so heavily if you're not worried about your own? The answer, prosecutors would later argue, was that Bob had been planning Stacy's death for some time, waiting for the right moment, the right excuse, the right cover story. The investigation also revealed Bob's pattern of infidelity in greater detail. Detectives discovered that he maintained profiles on multiple dating apps and websites, often using fake names and conflicting personal information. He had been juggling several relationships simultaneously, lying to each woman about his marital status, his age, his background. One particularly disturbing incident came to light involving a woman named Stephanie Shoemaker. She had met Bob at a grief support group, a group where people gathered to process the loss of loved ones. Bob told her that Stacy had died of cancer, another lie, and used the grief support group as a hunting ground for vulnerable women. During what Stephanie thought was a date, Bob sexually assaulted her at his home. She reported the incident to police, adding another layer of criminal behavior to Bob's increasingly dark profile. Despite all these suspicious circumstances, the lies, the infidelity, the financial motive, the inconsistent timeline, the lack of water on the bathroom floor, the undetermined ruling on Stacy's death certificate meant that prosecutors didn't have enough evidence to bring murder charges. The case appeared to be at a dead end. Bob Feldman was free to continue his life, raising his children, spending Stacy's life insurance money, dating new women, all while Stacy's body lay buried and her family struggled with grief and frustration. But Stacy's family, particularly her sister Susan Altman, refused to accept that this was simply a tragic accident. They were convinced that Bob had killed Stacy, and they were determined to prove it. Susan Altman's instincts about her sister's death were immediate and unwavering. When her father called on that March afternoon to tell her that Stacy was dead, Susan's immediate reaction was that her husband had killed her. Susan later told the Intermountain Jewish News how that phone call had unfolded, describing it as one of those moments that divides your life into before and after. "I live in the Boston area and my dad called me. It was a Sunday afternoon. I was getting ready to go to a sports game with one of my kids, and my daughter picked up the phone and said, 'It's Grandpa.' I told her, 'Tell him I can't talk right now. We're getting ready to go.' But she insisted, 'No, you have to talk to him.' When I picked up, my dad's voice was on the line. He said, "Stacy's dead." For a second, I couldn't even process it. I asked, "What happened?" fully expecting him to say it was a car accident. When Susan's father told her about the supposed bathroom accident, Susan couldn't accept it. She knew her sister. She knew Bob. And something wasn't right. My immediate reaction was that her husband had killed her, Susan told the paper. It wasn't a thought she arrived at after days of reflection. It was instinct, a gut certainty that she couldn't shake. As the months passed and the official investigation stalled, as the medical examiner's office issued its undetermined ruling and the case file gathered dust, Susan took matters into her own hands. She was convinced that Bob was getting away with murder, and she was determined not to let that happen. Susan's suspicions were based on years of observing Bob's behavior and the dynamics of his marriage to Stacy. She had watched as Bob systematically controlled and isolated Stacy through financial manipulation. She knew about his history of infidelity, about his threats to take the children if Stacy tried to leave. She knew in ways that police investigators couldn't what life had been like for Stacy in that house. Susan described Bob as a chronically underperforming salesman who was always looking for a free buck, always cutting corners, always scheming. She even recalled how he would bring broken suitcases to airports, then claim they were damaged during travel, and demand that airlines replace them with nicer models. It was a small-scale scam, barely worth the effort, but it revealed his dishonest character, his willingness to lie for minor gain. If he would lie to an airline for a free suitcase, what else would he do? But Susan knew that her suspicions alone wouldn't be enough to bring Bob to justice. She needed evidence. She needed expertise. She needed allies in her fight for truth. The breakthrough came nearly 2 years after Stacy's death, during a conversation with a psychologist relative. The Altman family, like many families dealing with sudden loss, sought support from friends and extended family who had professional training in grief counseling and trauma. As Susan described the circumstances of Stacy's death and the dynamics of her marriage to Bob, the psychologist listened carefully, and then made an observation that would change everything. It sounded, the psychologist said, like an abusive relationship that had escalated to murder. The psychologist suggested that Susan contact the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention, an organization that specializes in identifying and investigating cases where domestic violence has escalated to lethal force, particularly in cases that might appear to be accidents or suicides. Strangulation is one of the most common methods of intimate partner homicide, but it's also one of the hardest to detect. Unlike gunshot wounds or stab wounds, strangulation often leaves minimal external marks, especially if the victim is rendered unconscious quickly and the perpetrator uses techniques that don't leave obvious bruising on the neck. Many strangulation deaths are misclassified as natural deaths, accidents, or suicides because investigators don't know what to look for. Susan immediately reached out to the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention, and they put her in touch with Detective Randy Dennison, who had been the lead investigator on Stacy's case from the beginning. Detective Dennison had always harbored suspicions about the case, but lacked the expertise to prove his theories. The medical examiner's undetermined ruling had left him with nowhere to go. But the Training Institute connected them with Dr. Bill Smock, a police pathologist and an expert in domestic violence strangulation. Dr. Smock was a seasoned emergency room doctor with a fellowship in forensics who had participated in thousands of autopsies and crime scene evaluations. He had worked on some pretty high-profile cases, including serving as a key expert witness in the Derek Chauvin trial for George Floyd's murder and the Kenley Howard case, where he helped prove that a former Idaho State Police trooper had strangled his wife and staged her death as a suicide. Dr. Smock had achieved a 100% conviction rate in strangulation cases where his living forensics techniques were used. Living forensics is a relatively new field that focuses on documenting injuries on living victims of strangulation, creating a database of injury patterns that can then be applied to homicide investigations. When someone is strangled but survives, they can describe what happened, how the attacker positioned themselves, what techniques were used. By photographing and cataloging these injuries, experts like Dr. Smock can create a kind of signature, a pattern that appears again and again in strangulation cases. When that pattern shows up on a deceased victim, It can provide powerful evidence that strangulation occurred, even if the initial autopsy missed it. Susan's persistence had finally connected the case with someone who had the specialized knowledge to recognize what had really happened to Stacy. But it would still take months of meticulous review before Dr. Smock was ready to issue his findings. In the meantime, another crucial piece of the puzzle was falling into place. Susan McBride, the woman who had alerted Stacy to Bob's affair on the morning of her death, was about to make a discovery that would change everything. In June 2015, about 3 months after Stacy's death, Susan McBride was having another disappointing online dating experience. It reminded her of her encounter with Bob Feldman, and she began wondering what had happened with his marriage situation. Bob had told her that he and Stacy were getting divorced, that it was just a matter of time, that they were already living separate lives. Susan decided to do an internet search to see if Bob and Stacy had indeed gotten divorced, as he had claimed they would. She expected to find divorce filings, property settlements, custody arrangements, the paper trail that follows the end of a marriage. Instead of finding divorce records, she found something that made her physically ill. Stacy Feldman's obituary, dated March 1st, 2015. The same day that Susan had told her about the affair. The same day that Susan and Stacy had spoken on the phone. That brief 5-minute conversation where Stacy had been so kind, so composed, so certain that she was done with her husband. Susan later recalled, "I got physically ill. I knew immediately when I saw the date that that was the reason she was dead. It was a gut punch realization, the kind that makes your hands shake and your vision blur." Susan McBride understood in that moment that she had set something in motion. She hadn't killed Stacy, Bob had done that, but her email had been the catalyst. If she hadn't told Stacy about the affair, would Stacy still be alive? Susan immediately contacted the Denver Police Department and shared her story with Detective Dennison. She told him about her affair with Bob, about how she had discovered his lies, about the phone conversation she had had with Stacy on the morning of her death. Most importantly, she told him about Stacy's words, "I'm done with him." This was exactly the kind of breakthrough that Susan Altman had been praying for. Finally, there was evidence of motive. Bob had killed Stacy because she had discovered his affair and was planning to leave him, but it would still take the expertise of Dr. Smock to prove that Stacy's death was actually murder, not an accident or an unexplained medical event. When Dr. Bill Smock agreed to review the Stacy Feldman case in 2017, nearly 3 years after her death, he brought with him decades of experience in identifying concealed homicides. As an expert in domestic violence strangulation cases, Dr. Smock knew what to look for when examining cases where murder had been staged to look like accidents. He had seen it before. The husband who claimed his wife fell down the stairs, the boyfriend who said she slipped in the bathtub, the partner who insisted it was suicide. In each case, the body told a story that contradicted the official narrative if you knew how to read it. Dr. Smock spent months meticulously reviewing every aspect of the Stacy Feldman case. He examined the autopsy report, toxicology tests, and hundreds of photographs taken at the scene and during the autopsy. He consulted with colleagues, reviewed medical literature on strangulation injuries, and applied his living forensics database to identify patterns. What he found painted a horrifying picture of Stacy's final moments. The more than 80 injuries on Stacy's body told a story that the original pathologists had missed or misinterpreted. Dr. Smock determined that these weren't injuries from a slip and fall in the shower. They weren't from CPR attempts or from being pulled from a bathtub. They were injuries consistent with a violent, prolonged assault, the kind of assault that occurs when someone is fighting desperately for their life against an attacker who is much stronger and determined to kill. Dr. Smock testified, "It's my opinion she died from suffocation, strangulation, or a combination of both." He believed that Stacy had been attacked by someone who straddled her, using their knees to pin down her upper arms while they choked and suffocated her. This technique is sometimes called a positional asphyxiation assault, and it's particularly deadly because it combines multiple methods of cutting off oxygen to the brain. The evidence for this theory was compelling. Stacy had defensive wounds on the backs of her hands, showing that she had tried to push her attacker away, tried to fight back, tried to protect herself. The pattern of bruising on her upper arms was consistent with someone's knees pressing down on her, holding her in place while she struggled. The petechial hemorrhages in her eyes were classic signs of strangulation, caused when blood vessels burst due to increased pressure in the head and face during oxygen deprivation. Perhaps most tellingly, Dr. Smock found evidence that Stacy had been clothed when the attack began. There were imprints of fabric pressed into her skin, indicating that she was wearing clothes when she was being assaulted. This completely contradicted Bob's story that she had died while showering. If Stacy had been in the shower, she would have been naked or perhaps wearing a robe. But the fabric imprints suggested she was fully dressed, which meant the attack had likely occurred elsewhere in the house, in the bedroom perhaps, before Bob moved her body to the shower to stage the scene. Dr. Smock also examined the crime scene photographs with the meticulous attention of someone who had reviewed thousands of such images. He found additional evidence that the scene had been staged. Stacy was found with a dress watch on her left wrist, highly unusual for someone who was supposedly showering. Who wears a watch in the shower? There was no water on the bathroom floor, despite claims that Stacy had been pulled from a running shower. If Bob had truly dragged her body out of the tub while water was pouring from the shower head, the floor would have been soaked. Instead, it was dry. Some bottles in the shower had been knocked over, suggesting a struggle or perhaps Bob's attempt to make the scene look chaotic. But other bottles that should have fallen during such an event remained perfectly in place. It looked like someone had knocked over a few items intentionally, then stopped, creating a scene that appeared disturbed but not genuinely chaotic. Most damning of all, there was no bruising around the imprint of a metal shelf that had supposedly fallen on Stacy's body. When an object falls on a living person, someone whose heart is pumping, whose blood vessels are functioning, it causes bruising. Blood pools at the site of impact, creating the telltale discoloration that forensic pathologists look for. But Stacy had no bruising around the shelf imprint, which indicated that she was already dead when she came into contact with it. This was evidence that she had been placed in the shower after death, that Bob had arranged her body and the scene to create the illusion of an accident. Dr. Smock's analysis painted a clear picture of what had happened on the morning of March 1st, 2015. Bob had attacked Stacy in their bedroom, strangling and suffocating her during a violent assault that lasted several minutes. Stacy fought back as hard as she could, but Bob was larger, stronger, and utterly determined. He rendered her unconscious in as little as 5 to 10 seconds by applying pressure to her neck, cutting off blood flow to her brain. She stopped breathing within 1 to 2.5 minutes. Once Stacy was dead, Bob undressed her body and carried it to the bathroom. He placed her in the shower, turned on the water, and arranged the scene to make it look like she had slipped and fallen. He knocked over a few bottles to suggest a struggle or a fall. He positioned the metal shelf so it would appear to have fallen on her. Then he left the house with his children, went to the Purim Carnival, went to the bike shop, killing time until enough hours had passed that it would seem plausible he had just discovered her body. When he finally returned home around 3 p.m., he called 911, performed his theatrical display of shock and confusion, and hoped that investigators would accept the scene at face value. When asked if Stacy had suffered before she died, Dr. Smock replied simply, "Yes, ma'am." It was a devastating answer, spoken in a courtroom years later, but it captured the horror of those final minutes. Stacy knew she was being killed. She fought for her life. She struggled to breathe, and in the end, she lost. The injuries Dr. Smock identified were described as constellations of injuries that were not consistent with removal from the bathtub or resuscitation attempts. Instead, they showed evidence of what he called a vicious beatdown. Dr. Smock told the court that based on the evidence he reviewed in the case, the mother of two's death was a homicide. It was not an accident. It was not an unexplained medical event. It was murder. Based on Dr. Smock's expert analysis, the Denver District Attorney's Office finally had what they needed to prosecute Bob Feldman for murder. His report provided the crucial evidence that turned an undetermined death into a homicide case, giving prosecutors the foundation they needed to bring charges. On February 16, 2018, nearly 3 years after Stacy's death, Bob Feldman was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The arrest was coordinated carefully. Police knew that Bob had access to financial resources, that he had no strong ties to the community, and that he might attempt to flee if he knew charges were coming. They executed the arrest warrant early in the morning, before Bob had a chance to leave the house or make travel arrangements. He was taken into custody without incident, processed, and held without bail pending a preliminary hearing. Robert Feldman's arrest in February 2018 should have marked the beginning of the end. Instead, it marked the beginning of another frustrating chapter, filled with delays, legal maneuvering, and a justice system that seemed to move at a glacial pace. Bob was initially held without bail, the standard procedure in first-degree murder cases where the defendant is considered a flight risk and a danger to the community. But after a preliminary hearing, where a judge reviews the evidence to determine if there's enough to proceed to trial, Bob's defense attorneys argued for bail. They contended that the prosecution's case was built entirely on circumstantial evidence, that Dr. Smock's testimony was speculative, that there was no physical evidence tying Bob to the crime. The judge, to the dismay of Stacy's family, agreed to set bail at $1 million. Bob posted bond and was placed on house arrest. He was required to wear an electronic ankle monitor that tracked his movements, and he was forbidden from leaving his home except for pre-approved reasons like medical appointments or meetings with his attorneys. But Bob regularly violated the terms of his house arrest. He was caught leaving the house for unauthorized bicycle rides throughout Denver, sometimes posting the routes online on social media and fitness tracking apps, seemingly unconcerned about the consequences. Each violation resulted in a warning, but no additional penalties. It was infuriating for Susan Altman and the rest of Stacy's family, who watched as Bob appeared to treat his murder charge as a minor inconvenience rather than a serious legal matter. There was also a legal battle over Bob's use of Stacy's life insurance money. The $750,000 he had collected after her death was sitting in various accounts, and Bob wanted to use it to pay for his criminal defense attorneys. Stacy's family argued that this was unconscionable. Bob shouldn't be allowed to use money from a policy on Stacy's life to defend himself against charges that he murdered her. It was a cruel irony, they said, that Stacy's death benefit was now funding her killer's legal defense. But in 2019, the Colorado Supreme Court ruled that Bob could use $550,000 of the $750,000 payout to hire his criminal defense attorneys. The court reasoned that defendants have a constitutional right to adequate legal representation and that Bob's assets, including the insurance payout, could be used for that purpose even if those assets came from the victim. The case also became mired in delays caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. Courts shut down for months. Jury trials were postponed indefinitely. Key witnesses, including Dr. Smock and Susan McBride, were unable to travel safely. The justice system, already slow, ground nearly to a halt. Susan Altman, watching from Boston, felt like she was living in purgatory. "This man has taken 7 years from my life," she later said. 7 years of me being able to live. 7 years of being able to be mother to my children." It wasn't just grief. It was the grinding frustration of watching a case languish while Bob Feldman remained free, living in the house he had shared with Stacy, spending her money maintaining his innocence online and to anyone who would listen. Finally, in early 2022, nearly 7 years after Stacy's death, Robert Feldman would face a jury for her murder. The trial was scheduled for April, and both sides began their final preparations. The prosecution team, led by Deputy District Attorney Maggie Conboy, knew they had a strong circumstantial case, but worried about how a jury would react to the lack of direct physical evidence. There were no witnesses to the murder, no confession, no fingerprints on Stacy's neck. Everything depended on whether the jury would believe Dr. Smock's expert testimony and whether they would see through Bob's lies. The defense team, led by attorney Jeffrey Pagluca, planned to attack Dr. Smock's credentials and argue that 3 pathologists had already concluded Stacy's death was undetermined. They would present Bob as a grieving widower who had been wrongly accused, a man whose messy personal life had been misconstrued as evidence of murder. Robert Feldman's trial finally began in April 2022, more than 7 years after Stacy's death. Judge Edward Bronfin presided over the 9-day trial that captivated public attention in Denver and beyond. The courtroom was packed each day with journalists, legal observers, and members of Stacy's family who had waited so long for this moment. The prosecution's strategy was methodical and thorough. They called more than 30 witnesses, each providing a piece of the puzzle that, when assembled, painted a clear picture of premeditated murder. They started with Susan McBride, who flew in from Italy to testify about her phone call with Stacy on the morning of her death. Susan described how calm Stacy had been, how kind, how certain when she said those 4 critical words, "I'm done with him." The jury listened intently as Susan recounted the affair, Bob's lies, and her decision to tell Stacy the truth. It was powerful testimony because it established motive. Bob killed Stacy because she was leaving him, because he was about to lose control. The prosecution then called friends and family members who testified about Bob's controlling behavior, his pattern of infidelity, his financial manipulation. They called colleagues from Partners Seeking a Cure who said Stacy had been at work just days before her death, showing no signs of the illness Bob claimed she had. They called teachers from Temple Sinai who described Bob's strange behavior on the day of Stacy's death, the delayed pickup, the conflicting stories, the disheveled appearance. They called the 911 operator who had taken Bob's call and first responders who described the dry bathroom floor and Bob's theatrical performance. Each witness added another layer to the narrative, showing that Bob's version of events didn't hold up under scrutiny. But the prosecution's star witness was Dr. Bill Smock. Over the course of several hours, Dr. Smock walked the jury through his analysis of Stacy's injuries. He used a mannequin to demonstrate how Bob had attacked Stacy, straddling her and using his knees to pin down her arms while he strangled her. The demonstration was chilling. The courtroom fell silent as Dr. Smock positioned the mannequin on the floor, knelt over it and showed how an attacker could use body weight and leverage to immobilize a victim while cutting off their air supply. He explained the significance of each injury: the defensive wounds on Stacy's hands, the bruising on her upper arms, the petechial hemorrhages in her eyes, the fabric imprints on her skin. He showed the jury photographs of the crime scene, pointing out the dry floor, the stage shower, the watch on Stacy's wrist, the lack of bruising around the metal shelf imprint. Prosecutor Maggie Conboy told the jury, "Stacy Feldman can't tell you what happened that day, but her body can. And what it tells you is that she suffered a long, protracted, and horrific beating." It was a powerful closing argument, one that tied together all the evidence into a coherent narrative. The jury could see the logic of it, could understand how each piece of evidence supported the conclusion that this was murder, not accident. The most poignant testimony came from the Feldman's daughter, now 16 years old. She took the stand and described the morning of March 1st, 2015, a day that had started like any other. "I remember walking downstairs and having breakfast with my family," she testified. "There was talking. Nothing seemed unusual." She described going to religious school, winning prizes at the Purim Carnival, being excited to show her mother. And then she described returning home and being told by her father to put her coat away downstairs rather than going upstairs to see her mother. It was a small detail, but it spoke volumes. Why wouldn't Bob want his daughter to go upstairs? The obvious answer was that he already knew what she would find there. The defense fought back aggressively. Jeffrey Pagliuca called Dr. Smock a hired gun and a narcissist, arguing that 3 pathologists had maintained Stacy's death was undetermined and that Dr. Smock's analysis was speculative and self-serving. Pagliuca emphasized that there was no direct evidence linking Bob to the crime. No DNA under Stacy's fingernails, no witnesses, no confession. He argued that the prosecution was asking the jury to convict based on gossip and rumor rather than hard evidence. "We can't accept gossip and rumor instead of truth," Pagliuca told the jury. "This is a tragedy, not a homicide." The defense also suggested alternative explanations for Stacy's death, including the possibility that she had suffered an undetected medical event or that the injuries occurred during resuscitation attempts by paramedics. But the defense's case was weak, and they knew it. They couldn't explain the dry bathroom floor. They couldn't explain the fabric imprints on Stacy's skin. They couldn't explain why Bob had lied repeatedly about his activities on the morning of Stacy's death, why he had collected $750,000 in life insurance, why he had been active on dating apps just days after his wife's funeral. Throughout the trial, Bob sat quietly at the defense table, showing little emotion. Occasionally, he would laugh with his lawyers during breaks, a jarring contrast to the testimony about his wife's brutal murder being presented just feet away. It was a display of callousness that some jury members later said influenced their decision. How could an innocent man, wrongly accused of murdering his wife, sit in a courtroom and laugh while witnesses described her death? After 9 days of testimony, the case went to the jury. They deliberated for less than 3 hours before reaching a verdict. On April 26, 2022, the jury foreman stood and announced, "Guilty of first-degree murder." The courtroom erupted in emotion. Stacy's family members wept, embracing each other, relief and grief washing over them in equal measure. Bob showed no reaction, sitting stone-faced as the verdict was read. He would later say that he was in shock, that he couldn't process what was happening. But to observers, it looked like the same detached, emotionless demeanor he had displayed throughout the trial. Judge Bronfin scheduled sentencing for several weeks later, giving Stacy's family an opportunity to prepare victim impact statements. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was once again packed. Stacy's mother, Dorothy Malman, spoke first. Her voice shook with emotion as she addressed Bob directly. "If you really loved your children, you wouldn't have killed their mother," she said. "This is all because you couldn't keep your pants zipped and agreed to the divorce Stacy wanted. You are evil." Susan Altman spoke next, her voice stronger, filled with 7 years of pent-up frustration and grief. "I have been fighting for this for 7 years because my sister deserves to rest in peace," she said. "This man has taken 7 years from my life, and he's not taking one more second." When Judge Bronfin asked Bob if he wanted to make a statement, he replied simply, "No." No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of the pain he had caused. He offered nothing. Judge Bronfin sentenced Robert Feldman to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the mandatory sentence for first-degree murder in Colorado. Bob was immediately taken into custody and transported to a maximum security facility to begin serving his sentence. But Bob Feldman wasn't done fighting. He immediately filed an appeal, challenging various aspects of the trial. His lawyers argued that Dr. Smock's testimony should have been excluded, that the jury instructions were flawed, that the prosecution had been allowed to present prejudicial evidence about Bob's extramarital affairs. The appeal process would take more than 2 years, during which Bob remained incarcerated, but hopeful that an appellate court would overturn his conviction. In November 2024, the Colorado Court of Appeals issued a 51-page decision rejecting all of Bob's challenges. The 3-judge panel unanimously affirmed his conviction, finding that the trial had been conducted fairly and that the evidence supported the jury's verdict. Bob's primary argument was that Dr. Smock's testimony had usurped the county coroner's authority to determine cause of death. He claimed that because the medical examiner had ruled the death undetermined, it was improper for the prosecution to present expert testimony concluding it was a homicide. The appellate court firmly rejected this argument, ruling that an undetermined cause of death does not preclude prosecutors from presenting expert testimony about how someone died. The medical examiner's finding is just one piece of evidence, the court wrote, and juries are free to consider other expert opinions when reaching their verdict. The court also addressed Bob's claims about prejudicial evidence, finding that the testimony about his affairs and his pattern of lying was relevant to establishing motive and consciousness of guilt. The jury was entitled to hear about Bob's character and behavior, the court ruled, because it helped explain why he would commit such a crime. With his conviction affirmed, Bob has exhausted most of his legal options. He can still petition the Colorado Supreme Court to review the case, but the court is not required to accept the petition, and given the strength of the appellate decision, it seems unlikely they will intervene. As part of his sentence, Bob was also ordered to pay $111,600 for his children's therapy costs. The children, now teenagers, have had to grow up knowing their father murdered their mother, that their entire childhood was built on a lie. They have been in intensive therapy for years, trying to process the trauma of losing their mother, and then learning years later that their father killed her. Stacy's family established a fund in her memory to provide legal assistance to domestic violence survivors. The fund, called Stacy's Fund, helps women who are trapped in abusive relationships afford the legal representation they need to escape safely. Susan Altman became an advocate for domestic violence awareness, working with the Alliance for Hope International and speaking publicly about the warning signs of intimate partner violence. She has given interviews, written articles, and testified before legislative committees, using her sister's story to help prevent similar tragedies. Susan emphasizes that financial control is one of the most dangerous forms of abuse because it traps victims, leaving them with no resources to escape. She urges people to watch for red flags, partners who isolate their spouses from family, and friends who control all the finances, who threaten to take the children if their partner tries to leave. The conviction of Robert Feldman was ultimately the result of what prosecutors and media called the Sisterhood, a group of women who refused to let Stacy's killer escape justice. At the center was Susan Altman, whose relentless pursuit of justice drove the case forward when official investigations stalled. She spent 7 years of her life fighting for her sister, sacrificing her own peace of mind, her own ability to grieve normally, because she knew Bob had gotten away with murder and she couldn't let it stand. Susan McBride's courage in coming forward provided crucial evidence about motive and timeline. She could have stayed silent, could have walked away from the situation when she realized Bob was married. Instead, she chose to do the right thing, first by telling Stacy about the affair, and later by telling police about the phone call that revealed Stacy's state of mind just hours before her death. And without Dr. Smock's specialized knowledge of strangulation patterns and staged crime scenes, Bob might never have been charged with murder. His expertise turned an undetermined death into a provable homicide, giving prosecutors the foundation they needed to bring the case to trial. It was a team effort, driven by women who saw injustice and refused to accept it. The case also highlights the importance of specialized training in domestic violence homicides. Many strangulation deaths go undetected because investigators don't recognize the subtle injury patterns that differentiate strangulation from natural death or accident. Dr. Smock's living forensics techniques are now being taught to police departments and medical examiners across the country, helping ensure that other killers like Bob Feldman don't slip through the cracks. The Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention has trained thousands of law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and medical professionals, and that training has led to convictions in cases that would otherwise have remained unsolved. Stacy Feldman will be remembered not just as a victim, but as a beloved mother, sister, and community member, whose death led to important changes in how we investigate domestic violence cases. Friends describe her as a woman who radiated joy, who threw herself into motherhood and community service, who made everyone around her feel valued. Susan Altman said it best during her victim impact statement. She was just a ray of sunshine. She had these beautiful blue eyes. They just sparkle. You could see into her soul. In the end, love proved stronger than evil, and a sister's determination prevailed over a killer's deception. Stacy Feldman can finally rest in peace, knowing that justice has been served, that her children know the truth, and that her death has helped protect other women trapped in dangerous relationships. The case stands as a reminder of several critical truths about domestic violence and homicide investigation. First, financial control is a form of abuse that traps victims and increases danger. Second, infidelity and impending separation are among the most common triggers for intimate partner homicide. Third, initial autopsy findings are not always correct, and families should advocate for second opinions when circumstances seem suspicious. Fourth, expert testimony can be crucial in cases where physical evidence is ambiguous or has been staged. And finally, persistence matters. Susan Altman spent 7 years fighting for her sister, and that fight made all the difference. Without her refusal to accept the undetermined ruling, without her connection to the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention, without her relentless pressure on investigators to keep the case open, Bob Feldman would likely have lived out his life as a free man, spending Stacy's life insurance money, dating new women, perhaps even remarrying, all while his children grew up believing their mother had died in a tragic accident. But because Susan refused to let go, because she believed her instincts and fought for the truth, Bob Feldman is now serving life in prison without parole. He will never be free, He will never harm another woman. And Stacy's children, though they will carry the trauma of their mother's murder for the rest of their lives, at least know the truth. They know their mother didn't slip in the shower. They know she didn't die by accident. They know she was murdered by their father, and they know he has been held accountable. In a justice system that often fails victims of domestic violence, that often allows killers to slip through the cracks, the Stacy Feldman case stands as a testament to what can happen when determined people refuse to accept injustice. It's a dark story, a true crime narrative filled with betrayal and violence and calculated deception. But it's also a story about love. The love of a sister who wouldn't stop fighting the love of strangers like Susan McBride, who chose honesty over convenience. The love of experts like Dr. Smock, who dedicate their careers to giving voice to the dead. And in the end, that love was enough to bring a killer to justice and give Stacy Feldman the peace she deserved.